In the winter of 1842, a narrow brick building stood in Boston's Beacon Hill district, casting long shadows over cobblestone streets still glazed with morning frost. From the outside, the Mercy Home for Foundling Children appeared to be a sanctuary for the city's most vulnerable, its polished brass nameplate and curtained windows suggesting comfort within. But beneath its floorboards lay the remains of over 200 children, systematically starved to death by a woman Boston society had celebrated as a saint. The orphanage had operated for 7 years before anyone noticed a simple, haunting fact. Children entered through its doors, but none ever left alive. Before we continue with the story of Boston's forgotten children and the monster who silenced them, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. These stories reveal the darkest corners of American history that textbooks dare not mention. Leave a comment telling us what state you're listening from. These atrocities happen closer to home than you might think. The Boston of 1842 was a city of stark contrasts. In the mansions of Beacon Hill, oil lamps illuminated evenings of philosophical discourse, where the city's elite prided themselves as the moral compass of America. Reformers, abolitionists, and transcendentalist thinkers debating the nature of human goodness in wood-paneled salons. Ralph Waldo Emerson had recently delivered his Transcendentalist lecture at the Masonic Temple, inspiring Boston's intelligentsia with visions of spiritual self-reliance and moral perfection. But just blocks away, in the squalid tenements of the North End and Fort Hill, a different Boston struggled to survive. Irish immigrants crowded into windowless rooms, sometimes 15 to a space, fleeing the potato famine that had begun ravaging their homeland. Cholera, tuberculosis, and typhus swept through these neighborhoods with ruthless efficiency. Industrial accidents at the rope walks and leather tanneries left children orphaned with alarming frequency, creating a crisis of care that the city's infrastructure was ill-equipped to handle. These children, pale, hollow-eyed, and often unable to speak English, were the city's inconvenient reminder of its failures. Beacon Hill society discussed them in abstract terms during charity luncheons, treating child poverty as a theoretical problem rather than a lived reality. The wealthiest families, descendants of the original Puritan settlers who called themselves Boston Brahmins, considered charitable donations an essential display of social standing rather than a genuine commitment to welfare. The Brahmin approach to charity was performative rather than practical. Historian Margaret Thatcher would write a century later, "The goal was less to eliminate suffering than to be seen addressing it." Donations were carefully calibrated to demonstrate both generosity and financial prudence, enough to earn recognition in society. Pages, not enough to affect one's lifestyle. Into this environment of performative philanthropy stepped Dorothea Crane, a widow of 45 with no children of her own, who presented herself as the embodiment of maternal Christian charity. Her severe black dresses and tightly pulled gray hair projected authority, while her soft-spoken manner and frequent references to Scripture reassured Boston's elite that their donations were funding God's work. At charity luncheons, she would dab tears while describing the precious lambs entrusted to her care, always ending with appeals for additional funds to expand her miraculous work. The Mercy Home had opened in 1835 in a former merchant's residence on the less fashionable edge of Beacon Hill. The location was strategic, close enough to the mansions of potential donors, yet near enough to the immigrant neighborhoods to have a steady supply of orphan children. The 3-story brick building had been modified extensively before opening, with interior walls removed to create dormitory-style rooms that could house up to 60 children at capacity. From its inception, the Mercy Home received glowing coverage in Boston newspapers. The Columbian Sentinel praised Mrs. Crane's divinely inspired work after the inaugural gala raised over $5,000 from the city's wealthiest families. The Boston Evening Transcript regularly featured updates on the orphanage's supposed successes, including fictional accounts of children placed with loving families throughout New England. These stories, later discovered to have been written by Mrs. Crane herself and submitted as anonymous correspondence, created an illusion of remarkable effectiveness that attracted ever-increasing donations. Most impressive to Boston society was Mrs. Crane's claimed success rate in placing orphans with respectable families. While other institutions struggled to find homes for even a quarter of their charges, the Mercy Home reported placement rates exceeding 80%. Children who entered Mrs. Crane's care supposedly emerged transformed. The filthy, malnourished products of Boston's slums miraculously became clean, well-mannered, and desirable for adoption within months. What no one questioned was why visitors were discouraged, why no child ever returned to thank their benefactors, or why the building that supposedly housed dozens of orphans at any given time remained so strangely silent. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood had not intended to discover mass murder. At 36, the newly appointed public health inspector was more concerned with implementing modern sanitation practices than investigating charitable institutions. The son of a prominent physician, Blackwood had studied in Edinburgh and Paris before returning to Boston, bringing European ideas about public hygiene to a city still dumping waste into streets and harbors. Blackwood had witnessed the ravages of cholera during his time in Paris, where the disease had killed 20,000 people in 1832. He had studied under Dr. Pierre-Louis at the Hôtel Dieu Hospital, learning the emerging science of epidemiology and the crucial role of sanitation in preventing disease. His appointment to Boston's Public Health Department in 1841 had come after he published a scathing report on the city's water quality, linking contaminated wells to outbreaks of typhoid fever. His personal history also made him uniquely attuned to the plight of orphan children. Blackwood had lost his wife Eleanor during the birth of their daughter in 1838. The infant had survived only 3 days. This double loss had transformed Blackwood from an ambitious young physician into a more somber, dedicated public servant, channeling his grief into efforts to prevent similar tragedies through improved medical care and public health initiatives. His first visit to the Mercy Home came after 3 neighbors complained about a persistent smell emanating from the building. Mrs. Edith Thornton, whose townhouse shared a wall with the orphanage, described it in her letter to the health department as a most peculiar and unwholesome odor, particularly noticeable on warmer days, suggestive of improper waste disposal and potentially harboring disease. Assuming poor waste management, Blackwood expected a routine inspection resulting in recommendations for improved sanitation. What he found instead would haunt him until his death 40 years later. "I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped inside," Blackwood later wrote in his private journal, now preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives. "I have visited hospitals, morgues, and battlefields, yet never encountered an atmosphere so oppressive. It was not merely the physical odor, though that was certainly present. It was the weight of the silence, the absence of the sounds that should fill any place where children dwell." The orphanage entrance hall featured polished oak wainscoting and a modest chandelier, evidence of the donations that had furnished the building. Mrs. Crane greeted Blackwood with practiced warmth, her ledger tucked beneath one arm, her posture impeccable as she extended her gloved hand. Her gray eyes showed neither concern nor defensiveness at this unexpected official visit. "Dr. Blackwood, what a pleasure to welcome a representative of our fine city government," she said, her voice carrying the slight refinement of Boston's upper classes despite her claimed origins as a merchant's daughter from Salem. "I trust you'll find our humble establishment meets all requirements for health and safety. We pride ourselves on cleanliness, as proper hygiene is essential for children often arriving from less fortunate circumstances." The building's interior proved surprisingly austere, given the substantial donations it received. Bare walls, scrubbed floors, and iron-framed beds lined up with military precision in large dormitory rooms. No personal items were visible near any bed, No toys, books, or clothing to suggest individual children occupied these spaces. Most striking was the cleanliness. No institution housing dozens of children should have been so immaculate, so devoid of the natural disorder that accompanies young lives. The children are at their lessons or performing their chores, Mrs. Crane explained, guiding Blackwood through empty corridors. We maintain strict schedules to prepare them for productive lives in service or industry. Idle hands invite the devil's work, Doctor. Blackwood, when asked to see the children, Mrs. Crane gestured toward a locked door on the second floor, explaining that 5 children were quarantined with scarlet fever. The others, she insisted, were placed in apprenticeships or adopted by families throughout New England. Her ledger contained meticulous records, names, dates of admission, details of placement, all recorded in elegant script with corresponding donations and expenditures. You must understand, Doctor. Blackwood, she said, her voice lowering to a confidential whisper, most of these children come to us in desperate conditions, filthy, diseased, often mentally deficient from generations of poverty and vice. The transformation we achieve requires discipline and structure that casual visitors might misinterpret as severity. Blackwood requested to see the kitchen and food storage areas. Mrs. Crane showed him a well-stocked pantry with fresh bread, preserved meats, and winter vegetables, provisions that seemed untouched despite supposedly feeding dozens of hungry children. Our benefactors are most generous, Mrs. Crane explained. We never want for supplies. The smell that had prompted neighborhood complaints seemed strongest near the cellar door, a heavy oak barrier secured with an iron lock. When Blackwood inquired about examining the basement, Mrs. Crane's manner shifted slightly, her perpetual smile tightening at the corners. I'm afraid the cellar is quite unfit for a gentleman visitor at present, she said. Our maintenance man is in the midst of repairs to the drainage system, most unpleasant conditions. Perhaps on your next visit. As Blackwood prepared to leave, a sound stopped him, faint but unmistakable. A child's whimper, quickly silenced. When he inquired about it, Mrs. Crane's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. The wind, Doctor. Blackwood. These old buildings creak and moan like elderly patients, don't they? Now I've kept you long enough from your important work. That might have been the end of it. Another routine inspection completed, another report filed. But as Blackwood walked down Beacon Hill toward his office, something troubled him enough to detour to the city records department. If the Mercy Home was successfully placing dozens of children each year, there should be documentation of these adoptions and apprenticeships. What he found, or rather, what he didn't find, would reveal the first thread of a horrific tapestry. Not a single adoption or apprenticeship placement from the Mercy Home had been officially recorded. In 7 years of operation, no child had ever been legally transferred to another guardian. The question that would drive Blackwood's investigation was deceptively simple. Where had all the children gone? Boston's public health department occupied cramped quarters above a chemist's shop on Washington Street, the rooms perpetually filled with the pungent odors of medicinal compounds from below. The department, established only 5 years earlier following a devastating typhus epidemic, employed just 6 inspectors responsible for monitoring sanitation conditions throughout the rapidly growing city. Dr. Blackwood's colleagues found his growing obsession with the Mercy Home increasingly peculiar. Public health inspectors concerned themselves with sewage systems and contaminated wells, not the administrative practices of a respectable charity. His desk became cluttered with notes, cross-referenced ledger entries, and letters from officials in neighboring towns, all part of his increasingly desperate attempt to trace children who had supposedly been placed with families. You're overstepping your authority, his supervisor, Dr. Josiah Adams warned after Blackwood requested resources to investigate further. Mrs. Crane has friends on the city council. These accusations will destroy your career before it begins. Dr. Adams, a portly man whose primary qualification for his position was his cousin's seat on the city council, represented the entrenched resistance to genuine reform that characterized Boston's governance. At 58, he viewed public health as primarily concerned with containing diseases among the lower classes rather than addressing systemic problems. Your position requires scientific objectivity, not emotional speculation, Adams continued, tugging at his waistcoat with agitation. I assigned you to inspect waste management at the orphanage, not to interrogate its matron about record-keeping practices. Nevertheless, Blackwood continued his investigation during personal hours, systematically checking the names in Mrs. Crane's ledger against city death records. None appeared. He wrote to families supposedly adopting orphans, only to receive confused replies denying any knowledge of the Mercy home. Reference letters from prominent citizens turned out to be forgeries, the signatures close but imperfect imitations of the originals. The evidence of systematic deception mounted, but still provided no answer to the fundamental question: what had happened to the children? I believe something unconscionable is happening at the Mercy home, Blackwood wrote to Constable William Murphy, an acquaintance from medical school who had chosen law enforcement over medicine. Children are disappearing without legal trace, yet no one seems concerned enough to investigate. Murphy, a practical man with a weathered face that reflected 13 years of Boston police work, had seen enough of humanity's darker impulses to take such concerns seriously. His position as a constable in Boston's notoriously corrupt police force was maintained through competence rather than political connections, making him one of the few officials Blackwood felt he could trust. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, Cornelius, Murphy replied in his distinctive handwriting, rough and direct like the man himself, but I've learned never to dismiss the worst possibilities when children are involved. I'll accompany you tomorrow. They arranged to meet on Sunday morning, when the orphanage would presumably be preparing for church services. If Mrs. Crane's claims about children in her care were truthful, this would be the likeliest time to observe them directly. The unannounced visit was deliberately timed to circumvent the carefully orchestrated presentation Blackwood had received on his official inspection. The autumn morning brought a chill fog rolling in from Boston Harbor, shrouding Beacon Hill in gray mist that seemed appropriate for their grim purpose. Murphy arrived wearing his constable's uniform, the brass buttons and official insignia making it clear this was no longer an informal inquiry but a police matter. Mrs. Crane's composure showed its first crack when she opened the door to find 2 men instead of 1, and a police constable rather than a health inspector. Still, she maintained her facade, inviting them inside with practiced hospitality. I'm afraid you've caught us at a disadvantage, she explained, smoothing her black dress with pale hands. The children have already departed for services at Park Street Church with our assistant matrons. All of them? Murphy asked, his voice carrying the authority of his position. Even those with scarlet fever? Mrs. Crane's hand tightened around her ever-present ledger. Those poor souls remain in isolation, Constable. Their condition has worsened, I'm afraid. Our physician has ordered complete quarantine. I'd like to speak with this physician, Blackwood said. Dr. Whitfield visits weekly, Mrs. Crane replied. I'd be happy to arrange a meeting during his next appointment. Later investigation would reveal that doctor. Whitfield, like the adoptive families and reference letters, was entirely fictional, another character in Mrs. Crane's elaborate performance. No physician by that name was registered with the Massachusetts Medical Society, and no doctor had ever submitted required reports of infectious disease from the Mercy home. We require immediate access to all areas of this facility, Murphy stated, his official tone making it clear this was not a request, including the isolation ward and any basement or storage areas. Mrs. Crane's smile vanished. I must protect the children in my care, Constable. I cannot allow potential contamination. Mrs. Crane, Blackwood interrupted, there are no children here, are there? The silence
that followed seemed to confirm his suspicion.
Then, with remarkable composure, Mrs. Crane straightened her back and clutched her ledger to her chest like a shield. "I have nothing to hide, gentlemen. Follow me." She led them first to the isolation ward, unlocking the door with a key from the chain at her waist. The room contained 5 small beds with rumpled sheets and indentations in the pillows, suggesting recent occupation. A table held medicine bottles and spoons, all arranged with theatrical precision. The scene resembled a hospital ward, yet lacked the fundamental element that should have been present: patience. "Where are the children?" Murphy demanded. "They must have been moved to the infirmary downstairs," Mrs. Crane replied, her voice steady despite the obvious lie. "Dr. Whitfield may have—" "Show us the basement," Blackwood said quietly. What they discovered beneath the Mercy home would fundamentally change Boston's approach to child welfare and haunt the city's conscience for generations. The cellar stairs descended into darkness that seemed to swallow their lantern light. The smell that had prompted the initial complaints intensified with each step downward, a sickly sweet odor that both men recognized from medical training and battlefield experience. The main cellar appeared ordinary enough: stone walls, dirt floor, shelves stocked with preserved foods and household supplies. But Mrs. Crane's increasingly agitated behavior as they explored the space revealed her secret before they found physical evidence. "This is outrageous," she protested, standing between them and a rough wooden door partially hidden behind stacked grain sacks. Private charitable institutions are not subject to warrantless searches. The board of directors will hear about this violation. The board of directors exists only in your ledger. "Mrs. Crane," Blackwood replied, having verified this fact through his research, "like the adoptive families and Dr. Whitfield." When Murphy moved the sacks aside and forced the door, they entered a second, larger chamber that had been carefully concealed. Here, the earthen floor had been covered with lime, a common practice for masking odors and accelerating decomposition. Scattered across crude tables were small personal effects: worn shoes arranged by size, hair ribbons sorted by color, small toys and trinkets that had once belonged to children who had supposedly been placed with loving families. "These are donations," Mrs. Crane insisted, her composure finally cracking. "Items collected for future orphans." "This is a trophy room," Blackwood said, lifting a child's wooden horse worn smooth by small hands. "These belong to the children who disappeared." Murphy's lantern light fell on something half buried in the lime-covered floor, a small hand protruding from the earth, the fingers curled, as if still clutching for salvation. The constable, a veteran of Boston's most violent neighborhoods, staggered, backward at the sight. "Dear God," he whispered, crossing himself despite his Protestant upbringing. When Murphy recovered enough to begin investigating the disturbed earth, Mrs. Crane made no further attempt at deception. She stood silently, watching with clinical detachment as the horrified men uncovered the remains of a small child no more than 6 years old, the body emaciated to a degree that could only indicate deliberate starvation. "You'll find more," she finally said, her voice devoid of emotion. "The lime accelerates the process, but it takes time for a complete dissolution." That evening, Murphy returned with additional officers and 2 gravediggers experienced in exhumation. Through the night, they uncovered the remains of 17 children buried beneath the cellar floor. Subsequent excavations over the following weeks would reveal many more, some mere infants abandoned at the orphanage door, others as old as 12 who had been remanded to Mrs. Crane's care by city officials. Mrs. Crane offered no resistance when placed under arrest. She surrendered her ledger willingly, even pointing out specific entries that would help investigators understand her meticulous system. The ledger, examined closely, revealed the terrible truth behind the Mercy Home's operation. Each child was recorded with their name, if known, approximate age, and physical condition upon arrival. Subsequent entries tracked their progress, a euphemism for the systematic reduction of food until death occurred. Final entries noted the date of departure, alongside calculations of expenses saved and profits realized. Children who arrived healthier took longer to die, their entries showing greater savings as their care costs diminished while donation income continued. One entry, dated March 1839, provided a chilling glimpse into Mrs. Crane's methodology. Subject number 127, male child, approximately age 7, name given as Michael O'Brien, arrived with moderate physical condition despite Irish parentage. Initial daily rations set at 1,200 calories to maintain appearance for monthly inspector visit, reduced by 200 calories weekly thereafter, subject showing expected resistance to reduction, attempted kitchen theft on 4th week, punished accordingly. Estimated time to conclusion, 9 to 11 weeks. Projected savings, $37.42. A later entry confirmed the predicted outcome. Subject number 127 concluded May 17, 1839, 10 weeks from admission. Final weight 29 pounds. Personal effects: 1 pair leather shoes, poor condition, woolen cap, salvageable, metal medallion, St. Christopher added to collection. Occupancy cost recouped plus profit of $41.70. Higher than expected return due to extended survival period and continued donation from Barrett family specifically designated for subjects' education. The ledger contained hundreds of similar entries, each documenting the deliberate murder of a child through systematic starvation, alongside the meticulous calculation of profits derived from their suffering. The financial sections revealed that Mrs. Crane had accumulated over $35,000 during the 7 years of the orphanage's operation, an enormous sum for the period, equivalent to several $1,000,000 in modern currency. It was simply good business, Mrs. Crane explained during her interrogation, showing no remorse. These children were destined for lives of poverty and crime. Most would have died from disease or neglect regardless of intervention. I merely expedited the inevitable while creating a profitable enterprise that satisfied the charitable impulses of Boston society. When asked about the personal items found in the cellar, Mrs. Crane explained that these were collected before burial and sold or repurposed for new arrivals. Nothing was wasted in her efficient system of exploitation and murder. The wealthy donors never visit. They merely wish to see their names in newspaper announcements, she explained with chilling pragmatism. The city officials are grateful to have fewer children requiring public assistance. The children themselves have no voice. It is the perfect arrangement for all parties involved, except, of course, for the children who slowly starved in spotless beds while their supposed guardian presented fictional reports of their welfare to a society that never bothered to verify her claims. Mrs. Crane's methodical approach extended to every aspect of the orphanage's operation. The investigation revealed that she had designed specific architectural modifications to the building to facilitate her crimes. The children's dormitories featured extra insulation to muffle sounds. The drainage system had been modified to manage the odors of decay from the basement. Even the location of the orphanage, on a corner lot with only one adjacent building, had been chosen to minimize potential witnesses. The most disturbing aspect was the level of premeditation, Blackwood later testified. This was not a charity that became corrupted over time. It was designed from inception as a killing facility disguised as an orphanage. Mrs. Crane's background, investigated thoroughly after her arrest, revealed a pattern of deception that predated the Mercy home. She had operated a similar establishment in Providence, Rhode Island from 1829 to 1834, leaving just ahead of increasing scrutiny from local authorities. Before that, she had worked as a nurse in a Philadelphia hospital, where an unusual number of patients had died under her care. In each location, she had cultivated a reputation for piety and charitable works while systematically exploiting those under her supervision. The true Dorothea Crane, investigators discovered, had been born Abigail Hatch in 1797, the daughter of a failed merchant. After her father's bankruptcy and suicide in 1815, she had moved through various positions in households and institutions, always gravitating toward situations that offered minimal oversight and maximum control over vulnerable populations. Her marriage to shipmaster Thomas Crane in 1820 had ended with his mysterious death at sea in 1828, leaving her a modest inheritance that had funded her first independent venture in Providence. She was remarkably skilled at presenting herself as the ideal Christian widow, wrote the Boston Evening Transcript in its coverage of the case. Her dress, speech, and manner precisely calibrated to inspire confidence among Boston's elite. She knew exactly which scriptural quotations would resonate with Protestant sensibilities, which charitable platitudes would open checkbooks, and which expressions of maternal concern would deflect any potential questions. When the magnitude of Dorothea Crane's crimes became public, Boston experienced a moral crisis that transcended the sensational aspects of the case. Here was not merely a murderer, but an indictment of the entire system of charitable oversight, or rather, the complete lack thereof, that had allowed such atrocities to continue undetected for 7 years. The investigation revealed that Mrs. Crane had perfected a system that exploited every weakness in Boston's social welfare structure. She targeted the most vulnerable children, those with no living relatives to inquire after them, and constructed elaborate fictional narratives about their care and placement. The wealthy donors whose names appeared in her ledgers had written checks but never visited to verify how their money was being spent. City officials, overwhelmed by the growing number of orphaned and abandoned children, had been grateful for an institution willing to accept them without question. Most disturbing was the calculation behind Mrs. Crane's methods. She had determined that the minimum amount of food required to keep a child alive was far less than the per-child stipend provided by the city and private donations. By gradually reducing portions while maintaining the appearance of proper care, she could extract maximum profit before the inevitable death. The starvation was calibrated, never so sudden as to raise alarm, but relentless enough to ensure no child survived longer than necessary. She kept them alive just long enough to collect quarterly payments, Dr. Blackwood testified at her trial. The system was designed not for immediate death, but for maximum financial extraction before disposal. The few children who had been in the orphanage at the time of discovery provided testimony that horrified even the most hardened courtroom observers. 8-year-old Sarah Collins, who had been at the Mercy Home for 6 weeks, described the systematic reduction of food that had already left her too weak to stand without assistance. "At first, we got a bowl of porridge for breakfast and soup with bread for dinner," she testified, her voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. Then the bowl got smaller. Then just half full. Mrs. Crane said we hadn't earned more because we were wicked children. She said hungry children were closer to God. Sarah's testimony revealed that the children were kept isolated from each other, each believing their treatment was unique punishment rather than systematic policy. They were forbidden to speak during meals or after bedtime, with severe consequences for any communication. Several had witnessed other children being taken to the basement, ostensibly for punishment, never to return. "Mrs. Crane told us they'd been adopted by fine families," Sarah said. "She said if we were good and accepted our hunger as God's will, we might be chosen too." The trial of Dorothea Crane became a sensation that dominated Boston newspapers throughout the spring and summer of 1843. The public gallery was consistently filled with Boston's elite, many of whom had personally contributed to the Mercy Home and now found their names connected to mass murder. Several prominent families attempted to have their donations stricken from the record, leading to accusations of concern for reputation rather than justice for the victims. Mrs. Crane's defense offered no denial of the facts, focusing instead on her mental state. Her attorney, Jacob Phillips, argued that years of widowhood and financial hardship had distorted her understanding of charity, transforming her from benefactor to predator through a gradual corruption of moral principles. This defense collapsed when prosecutors presented evidence of premeditation. The orphanage had been designed from its inception as a killing facility, with architectural modifications specifically created to conceal sounds and odors. The most damning evidence came from Mrs. Crane herself. Given the opportunity to express remorse, she instead offered a cold assessment of social realities that shocked even the most hardened observers. These children were born into circumstances that guaranteed short, painful lives, she told the court. Their parents were drunkards, criminals, or immigrants who could not care for them properly. Society pretends to value all life equally, but we all know this is mere sentiment rather than practical reality. I provided clean beds and peaceful deaths rather than slow suffering in gutters and workhouses. If anything, I showed more mercy than the hypocrites who claim outrage while turning blind eyes to children begging in their streets. Throughout the trial, Mrs. Crane maintained a composure that many found more disturbing than any display of madness would have been. She attended each day dressed in the same black gown, her hair neatly arranged, her expression impassive as witnesses described the suffering of children under her care. She took meticulous notes during testimony, occasionally passing suggestions to her increasingly uncomfortable attorney. The only moment her facade cracked came during Dr. Blackwood's testimony about the physical condition of the children's remains. As he clinically described the effects of prolonged starvation on developing bodies, the loss of muscle tissue, the compromised organ function, the body consuming itself from within, Mrs. Crane smiled. It was a brief expression, quickly suppressed, but witnessed by enough courtroom observers to be reported in every Boston newspaper the following day. The Boston Daily Advertiser described it as a smile of such profound satisfaction that several ladies in the gallery were overcome and required assistance leaving the courtroom. It was not the expression of a deranged mind, but rather the pleased countenance of an artist, hearing her work praised by a knowledgeable critic. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict. On October 17, 1843, Dorothea Crane became the first woman executed by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts since the witch trials of the previous century. She walked to the gallows without assistance, maintaining her composure until the end. Her final statement was not a plea for forgiveness, but a cold condemnation of those she considered her accomplices. Boston society created the Mercy Home through its indifference, she declared from the scaffold. I merely provided the service you all secretly desired, the disappearance of inconvenient children. The execution was attended by an estimated 5,000 people, an extraordinary crowd even in an era when public hangings were common social events. The Boston police had anticipated potential unrest, particularly from the immigrant communities whose children had been among Mrs. Crane's victims. Instead, witnesses described an eerie silence as the trapdoor opened and Dorothea Crane dropped to her death. No cheers, no cries of justice, only the collective exhalation of a city confronting its complicity in unimaginable evil. Mrs. Crane's body was not claimed by any relatives and was initially destined for use as a medical specimen at Harvard Medical School. However, public outcry against giving her remains any scientific value led to her burial in an unmarked grave on the grounds of the Cambridge almshouse, a pauper's burial for a woman who had accumulated a fortune through murder. The scandal fundamentally transformed Boston's approach to charitable oversight. The state legislature passed what became known as the Mercy Home Act in 1844, establishing mandatory quarterly inspections of all institutions housing children. The law required documentation of each child's physical condition, independent verification of all claimed adoptions or apprenticeships, and unannounced visits by medical professionals. These reforms spread beyond Massachusetts, influencing similar legislation in New York, Pennsylvania, and other states with significant orphan populations. The case became a reference point in debates about institutional care versus family placement, with advocates of the latter citing the Mercy Home murders as evidence that large institutions inherently lacked the accountability of family settings. For Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, the case became both the defining achievement and the persistent nightmare of his career. He was appointed to lead the newly created Child Welfare Division of the Massachusetts Board of Health, a position he held until his retirement in 1875. During those 3 decades, he personally inspected hundreds of orphanages, foundling homes, and residential schools, always searching for signs of the systematic neglect he had discovered at the Mercy Home. The most terrifying aspect of Dorothea Crane's crime was not its scope, but its simplicity, Blackwood wrote in his memoirs published shortly before his death in 1883. She understood that society's claimed values rarely align with its actual behaviors. We profess concern for vulnerable children while designing systems that render them invisible. She merely exploited the gap between our pretensions and our practices. The revelation that Boston society had financially supported mass murder while congratulating itself on its charitable works triggered a period of painful self-examination. Several prominent families who had been major donors to the Mercy Home withdrew from public life, their names forever tainted by association with Mrs. Crane. Others channeled their shame into genuine reform efforts, funding not just institutions but systems of accountability and oversight. Reverend William Ellery Channing, one of Boston's most influential ministers, delivered a sermon at Federal Street Church that directly addressed the moral failings exposed by the case. "We have been philanthropists in theory and misers in practice," he declared to his wealthy congregation. "We have purchased virtue cheaply, writing checks instead of engaging hearts. True charity is not satisfied with giving money. It demands verification, involvement, and genuine concern for outcomes. The blood of these children cries out not just against Mrs. Crane, but against a society that abandoned them to her tender mercies while congratulating itself on its generosity." The building that had housed the Mercy Home was demolished in 1845, the materials sold, and the proceeds used to establish a memorial fund for the victims. For decades afterward, the empty lot remained undeveloped, local superstition preventing new construction. When a commercial building was finally erected on the site in 1879, workers reported discovering additional remains that had been missed during the original investigation, small bones buried deep beneath foundation stones, silent testimony to children whose names and stories had been lost forever. The final accounting of Dorothea Crane's victims remains incomplete. Based on ledger entries and physical evidence, investigators estimated that between 204 and 237 children died at the Mercy Home during its 7 years of operation. Many were recorded only as male infant or female child, approximately age 4, their identities erased before they even arrived at the orphanage door. What makes the Mercy Home case particularly significant in American criminal history is not just the number of victims, but the systematic nature of the murders and the social conditions that enabled them. Dorothea Crane did not kill in passion or psychosis, but through careful calculation and exploitation of social indifference. Her crimes were possible only because the children she targeted had already been deemed unworthy of serious. The most disturbing question raised by the Mercy Home murders was how such systematic evil could operate openly in a society that considered itself enlightened and moral. The orphanage stood in the heart of Boston, surrounded by the homes of educated, wealthy citizens who prided themselves on social conscience. Yet none noticed or chose to investigate the absence of children's voices from a building supposedly dedicated to their care. Mrs. Crane's greatest insight was understanding that people preferred beautiful lies to uncomfortable truths, wrote Elizabeth Peabody. the transcendentalist educator and reformer who had once sat on a committee that awarded the Mercy Home a certificate of excellence. She provided us with the fiction we desired, that orphan children were being rescued, reformed, and placed with loving families while conducting an enterprise of systematic murder behind a facade of Christian charity. The most haunting legacy of the Mercy Home case was not the shocking nature of the crimes themselves, but the recognition of complicity. Dorothea Crane had correctly identified society's willingness to accept comforting fictions rather than confront uncomfortable realities about its most vulnerable members. Her ledgers revealed not just her own calculated cruelty, but the names of dozens of prominent citizens who had donated money without ever verifying how it was used. The graves beneath the Mercy Home floor exposed not just murdered children, but the hollow center of Victorian charity, the vast distance between public proclamations of virtue and private practices of neglect. The crime was not merely that one woman killed hundreds of children, but that hundreds of citizens created a system where such killing could continue undetected for years. There were 43 empty beds in that building, Blackwood wrote in an editorial published in the Boston Post. 43 children supposedly living there at the time of our inspection. Yet not a single citizen of Boston had seen these children walking to church, playing in the yard, or engaging in any normal childhood activities. We accepted their invisibility because it was convenient to do so. This uncomfortable truth provoked different reactions across Boston's social landscape. Some wealthy families withdrew further into defensiveness, insisting they had been victims of Mrs. Crane's deception rather than enablers of her crimes. Others embraced genuine reform, establishing new charitable organizations with transparent practices and rigorous accountability. Measures. The Boston Female Asylum, a similar institution founded in 1800, immediately opened its doors to public inspection and implemented new reporting practices to document the welfare of each child in its care. Other orphanages throughout New England followed suit, recognizing that transparency was now essential for public trust. The case also transformed how Boston's newspapers reported on charitable works. The glowing, unverified accounts of institutional successes that had been standard practice gave way to more substantive reporting that emphasized verification and results. The Boston Daily Times established a charitable accountability column that regularly investigated and reported on the actual conditions in various charitable institutions throughout the city. Lydia Maria Child, the prominent abolitionist and women's rights advocate, drew explicit parallels between the Mercy Home murders and the broader social issues of the era. We cannot express horror at Mrs. Crane's treatment of children while maintaining systems that treat whole categories of human beings as disposable, she wrote. The same society that ignored starving orphans on Beacon Hill continues to tolerate the enslavement of children in the South and the exploitation of child laborers in our factories. The question we must ask is not how one woman could commit such crimes, but how our social arrangements render certain lives so worthless that their disappearance raises no alarm. The most immediate practical impact of the case was on Boston's approach to orphaned and abandoned children. The investigation had revealed that many of Mrs. Crane's victims were not true orphans, but children temporarily surrendered by parents facing extreme hardship. Immigrant families who could not feed their children during winter months, widows who needed to work, fathers injured and unable to provide care. These parents had believed the Mercy Home offered temporary refuge, only to be told later that their children had been placed with families in distant towns. In response, Boston established the Children's Temporary Home in 1844. Specifically designed to provide short-term care with the explicit goal of family reunification rather than permanent separation. The institution required regular parental visits and maintained detailed records of each child's physical condition and eventual disposition. This more nuanced approach to child welfare reflected growing recognition that poverty alone should not be grounds for permanent family separation, a significant shift from the prevailing attitude that poor parents were inherently unfit and that their children would benefit from being placed with more respectable families. Long after Dorothea Crane's execution, Boston struggled with the implications of this collective failure. The city that had positioned itself as America's moral compass had harbored a monster in its midst, feeding her victims through indifference and willful blindness. The subsequent reforms, while necessary and important, could not erase the fundamental question that lingered in the city's conscience. How many had noticed something wrong but chosen silence over intervention? This question haunted Dr. Blackwood throughout his remaining career. His investigation of the Mercy home had begun with physical evidence, the smell that neighbors complained about, but he later discovered that there had been other signs that should have prompted earlier intervention. A former delivery boy for a local bakery revealed that he had never once seen children at the orphanage, despite weekly deliveries for years. A seamstress who had been commissioned to make children's clothing had become suspicious when the same order was repeated every few months, as if the garments were being cycled through different wearers. A chimney sweep had noticed that the kitchen fires were rarely used despite the well-stocked pantry. Each of these individuals had noticed anomalies but dismissed their concerns, deferring to Mrs. Crane's reputation and social standing rather than trusting their own observations. This pattern of deference to authority at the expense of personal judgment became a central theme in discussions about preventing similar atrocities. Evil thrives not just through active malice, but through the passive acquiescence of ordinary people, Blackwood wrote in his final public address before retirement. We must train ourselves and our children to question inconsistencies, to verify claims, and to value truth above social comfort. The opposite of evil is not goodness, but attention. The physical spaces associated with the Mercy Home murders took on symbolic significance in Boston's collective memory. The empty lot where the orphanage had stood became a place of informal memorial, with local residents leaving flowers, toys, and candles on the anniversary of the discovery. When commercial development finally claimed the site in 1879, the new building incorporated a small bronze plaque acknowledging the history of the location, though its wording, site of the former Mercy Home, 1835 to 1843, did little to convey the magnitude of the tragedy that had occurred there. More significant was the creation of Boston's first public playground on land, purchased with funds from the sale of Mrs. Crane's assets. Blackwood Memorial Park, opened in 1855, represented a deliberate attempt to reclaim space for living children as a counterpoint to the silenced voices of the Mercy Home victims. The playground, revolutionary for its time and being open to children of all social classes, embodied the new emphasis on visibility and well-being that emerged from the case. "Let children be seen and heard," read the inscription on the park's entrance gate. "Let their voices rise as testimony to our vigilance." The case also left its mark on American literature and social commentary. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who lived in Salem during the trial, is believed to have drawn inspiration from Mrs. Crane for the character of Mistress Hibbins in The Scarlet Letter, 1850, a respectable widow whose public piety masks private evil. Similarly, Louisa May Alcott's lesser-known work, Behind a Mask, 1866, features a manipulative governess whose calculated performance of virtue allows her to prey upon a wealthy family, echoing Mrs. Crane's methodology. More explicitly, the case influenced a generation of social reformers who cited the Mercy Home murders as evidence of the need for systematic oversight of institutions and transparency in charitable operations. Charles Loring Brace, founder of the Children's Aid Society in New York, specifically referenced the case in his advocacy for placing orphaned children in foster homes, children with families rather than in institutions, arguing that family settings provided natural accountability that large orphanages lacked. Mrs. Crane understood something fundamental about institutional care, Brace wrote in 1859. The more children are congregated together, the less each individual child is seen. In a family, one child's absence from breakfast is immediately noticed. In an orphanage housing dozens, who counts each face at each meal? Who notices one voice missing from many? This perspective contributed to the development of the placing out system that would eventually relocate thousands of urban orphans to rural homes throughout the Midwest. A program with its own complex legacy, but one explicitly designed to avoid the anonymous institutional neglect exemplified by the Mercy Home. For the surviving children who had been in the orphanage at the time of its discovery, the aftermath brought mixed outcomes. The 5 children found alive when Blackwood and Murphy raided the facility had already been substantially weakened by starvation. 2 died within weeks, despite intensive medical intervention. The 3 survivors, Sarah Collins, Thomas Murphy, and Elizabeth Pierce, became symbols of resilience in Boston's newspapers. Their recoveries followed with the same public interest that had previously been devoted to Mrs. Crane's trial. Sarah Collins, whose testimony had been so devastating during the trial, was adopted by a Brookline family and lived to the age of 76, eventually founding a charitable organization dedicated to monitoring the treatment of institutionalized children. Thomas Murphy, only 4 years old at the time of rescue, struggled with lifelong health problems stemming from early malnutrition, but became a successful carpenter. Elizabeth Pierce's story is less documented, though census records indicate she married at age 19 and moved to western Massachusetts. The families who had unknowingly surrendered their children to death rather than temporary care represented another category of victims. Many came forward after news of the murders broke, seeking information about children they had entrusted to the Mercy Home years earlier. The process of matching ledger entries to these inquiries revealed the full extent of Mrs. Crane's deception. Parents who had been told their children were thriving in apprenticeships or adoptive homes learned they had died within months of surrender. For Boston's Irish immigrant community, particularly hard hit by Mrs. Crane's predation, the case became a turning point in their relationship with the city's Protestant establishment. The revelation that their children had been systematically murdered while Protestant charitable organizations celebrated Mrs. Crane's work reinforced their suspicion of outside institutions and accelerated the development of parallel Catholic charitable organizations explicitly designed to serve their community. When the Mercy Home was finally demolished, witnesses reported a phenomenon that would become part of Boston folklore. As the walls came down and sunlight touched spaces that had been dark for years, neighbors claimed they could hear something rising from the ruins. Not cries or wails, but a heavy silence more profound than any absence of sound. It was the silence of children who had never been permitted to speak, whose suffering had been systematically ignored, and whose deaths had been carefully hidden from a society that preferred not to see them. The site where the Mercy Home once stood is now occupied by luxury condominiums, the tragic history commemorated only by a small bronze plaque easily overlooked by passing pedestrians. But on certain winter mornings, when fog rolls in from Boston Harbor and shrouds Beacon Hill in gray, some claim they can still feel that peculiar silence, the overwhelming quiet of a place where children lived and died without ever making enough noise to disturb the conscience of the city around them. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Mercy Home murders is not in the physical spaces or institutional reforms, but in the philosophical questions the case continues to raise about social responsibility and moral attention. How do we ensure that the most vulnerable members of society remain visible? What systems of accountability protect those without the power to protect themselves? How do we train ourselves to question comforting narratives when confronted with disturbing inconsistencies? Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, who lived with these questions for the 4 decades following his discovery, offered a perspective that remains relevant in our contemporary discussions of institutional care and social welfare. The children of the Mercy Home died not just from starvation of the body, but from starvation of attention, he wrote in his final public address in 1875. They perished because no one was watching, no one was listening, no one was counting each face and noting each absence. The true lesson of this tragedy is not merely the need for better regulations or more frequent inspections, though these are certainly important. The deeper lesson is that justice for the vulnerable requires our sustained attention, our willingness to look directly at uncomfortable realities rather than accepting convenient fictions. The case of Dorothea Crane and the Mercy Home murders reminds us that evil often thrives not through overwhelming force, but through the accumulated weight of small accommodations, the questions not asked, the anomalies not investigated, the responsibilities deferred. The children buried beneath the orphanage floor were victims not just of one woman's calculated cruelty, but of a society's collective unwillingness to see what was happening in plain sight. The truly frightening aspect of the Mercy Home case, wrote reformer Samuel Gridley Howe in 1860, is not that one woman could commit such crimes, but that hundreds of people could unwittingly support her in doing so. Each donation given without verification, each report accepted without question, each inspection conducted as mere formality, these were the building blocks of catastrophic failure. The monstrous act was not just Dorothea Crane's starvation of children, but Boston society's starvation of attention to their welfare. As we contemplate contemporary institutions caring for vulnerable populations, whether children, the elderly, prisoners, or others dependent on systems beyond their control, the Mercy Home case offers a stark reminder that good intentions without accountability can pave the way to atrocity. The quality of care can never be assumed. It must be verified through rigorous oversight, transparent practices, and a culture that encourages questioning rather than deference. The graves of the Mercy Home children, scattered across Boston's public cemeteries in unmarked plots, represent one of America's most shameful collective failures. Yet the reforms that followed their discovery, the insistence on verification, the emphasis on visibility, the recognition that charitable intent must be matched with practical oversight, form an important, if insufficient, memorial to their suffering. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to these forgotten children is our continued vigilance on behalf of the vulnerable, our refusal to accept comfortable narratives without evidence, our willingness to question authority when observations don't align with claims, and our commitment to ensuring that no child again disappears without prompting immediate and thorough investigation. In the words of Sarah Collins, who survived the Mercy Home to become one of Boston's most determined child welfare advocates, remember us not just with memorials, but with attention. Count every child, note every absence, question every inconsistency. The silent graves beneath Beacon Hill should teach us that the opposite of cruelty is not just kindness, but watchfulness. If this story has affected you as deeply as it has affected us, please share it so others can learn about this forgotten chapter of American history. Hit the like button to help more people discover these hidden stories, and don't forget to subscribe for more dark chapters that textbooks neglect to mention.